I have dozens of fruit trees around the homestead, including apples, pears, plums, and peaches. The vast majority were planted at the same time the first spring we lived here. However, there is a marked difference in the height, breadth, health, and vitality of those inside the deer fence and those outside. Deer have become some of my biggest nemesis, particularly in this northeastern apple orchard. This year, I'm determined to change that. I'm going to be grafting onto nearly all the existing trees, a process known as top-working. I'll start with these in the northeast orchard, a place that did not get fenced in due to the cost, both monetary and time, associated. Back then, I started by just fencing deer out of the annual food production garden, so these trees in the northeast corner of our property have paid a heavy price. There are several methods of top working, each with its pros and cons, or perhaps more accurately, best situations in which to use. On these 6-year-old trees, which are stressed beyond belief and should be as tall as those inside the fence and likely about to produce their first crop, I'm going to use a technique called cleft grafting. I'll be using another technique on some of the larger trees, but due to the diameter of these trees being so close to that of the scion, I'm going to use cleft grafts for these. A couple hundred years ago, some people who were good at grafting made part of their annual living top working for people throughout their home and neighboring communities for pennies per graft. Back then, everyone had fruit trees in their front yards. Indeed, according to accounts I've read in books by historians like Maine's John Bunker, many people throughout Maine, around the time between the Civil War and the Great Depression, were cultivating commercial orchards of different scales. I don't know how the farmers and roving grafters kept all their scions straight, but the method I came up with was to label each individual stick on a flat surface that I could carry around with me. It was time-consuming. It took about an hour and a half, but I didn't know how else to do it. It certainly kept everything straight. It would have been easier if I was grafting an entire orchard to 1 or 2 varieties, but since I wanted as much diversity of fruit as possible, that wasn't an option. For many, the hardest part of grafting is just like the hardest part of pruning, overcoming the fear that you're going to hurt the tree by cutting too much. There are 2 methods I've found to overcome this. First, get out in nature as much as possible. One thing you notice after spending time walking in the woods, along roadsides, at the edges of fields or bodies of water, is that everything wants to live, and it's actually really hard to overcome the tendency of all living things to cling to that life. The second is to follow around someone who has some years on you and the experience you're hoping to have at their age, particularly if you happen to be following someone around who knows how to graft or prune. They tend to be no-nonsense, quick, and merciless. In the case of tending fruit trees, those are actually good qualities. You already saw me hack off at least 2/3 of this tree, which wasn't that big a deal in this case because the tree has been so stunted by the deer. Wait till I get to the established trees. It's even scarier. Most grafting techniques are named very aptly. In the case of a cleft graft, it's called that because I'm putting a big cleft, or split, in the tree or limb, then stuffing a trimmed scion into that cleft. The most important thing to know about grafting is how the tree works. This is true whether you're top working in mid-May, at least that's when it's best done here in Central Maine, bud grafting in August, or bench grafting in a cold, dark basement in March. The majority of the rootstock and scion does nothing in terms of making the graft union. All the action happens in the cambium layer, which is the layer of the tree that sits just below the bark, but isn't yet the wood itself. That's where all of the nutrients, water, and essentially all biology passes back and forth between roots and leaves. I tend to think of it as a massive network of train tracks. All I'm doing when grafting is throwing the switch so the train switches tracks from the tree that was growing to the one I want to grow. In order for this to work, the cambium of the scion, which is the cutting from the tree you want to clone, has to line up with the cambium of the rootstock. Technically, even the slightest bit that's in contact with each other is enough. But in practice, you want as much scion cambium touching as much rootstock cambium as possible. Ideally, the diameter of the scion would match the diameter of the rootstock. That would make the cambium layer line up on both sides of the cylinder of the trunk. But in my experience, that's rare. So the next best thing is to pick the side that lines up best and go with that. Normally, you want to snip the scion so that you only have 1 to 2 buds. Typically, you do this before taping the graft. I forgot on this first graft. It's best to do it before the graft is taped because when you snip it, you might move it, and then the alignment of the cambium may no longer be there. In this case, the scion didn't move very much, so I'm confident it will be fine. Going forward, I'll make that cut before doing the taping.